you again. My name's Matthew. I'm with our local FRSO chapter Dayton as well as Ohio for Palestine, and I'm also a member of a community of people who are currently upset and frankly tired of the NATO village that comes every so often to downtown Dayton in quasi celebration of the Dayton Accords in the 90s. So, me and a couple of friends and community members and I have decided to start this campaign with Resist NATO, and we plan to plan some actions in terms of protest of this village. And today we're going to just do a brief teaching of uh, the history of NATO, what NATO does, why they're here this May, etc. If we want to go ahead and if we're all ready, I can pull up the presentation I have put together, which we'll do in tandem with a group of our panelists as well. I don't know, do we want to, let's do an introduction of our panelists. I don't know if we want to go ahead and start around with, I'll throw it to my comrade Liz, who is also with my chapter as well, and then we'll go to ILPS, etc. How does that sound?
That sounds fine to me. Hey everyone, I'm Liz. I'm from Dayton. Um, a friend of Matthew's and also very sick of NATO wanting to come to Dayton. It's going to be really disruptive for the people who live here. And we're just ready to do something about it and very happy to be here. I'm available for tech support and I'm going to keep track of who has questions later on. So if you do have a question, hold it until the end and we'll get to it when the time comes.
I can go ahead and go next. Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel. I'm based here in Seattle, and speaking on behalf of ILPS US, the International League of People's Struggle, the country chapter here. And we'll be sharing a little bit about the US's role in NATO and the resistance to it in this country. Although I'm not planning to mobilize out to the Midwest. Excited to be able to support and hope folks have a good time resisting. I will pass it over to Oz.
Hello everyone, it's Oz from other side of the world in Cyprus. I'm with the Resist NATO Europe and also ILPS and also a local organization here in Cyprus called Union of Cypriots. I will talk about the NATO's presence in Europe and the current developments in Europe. I will pass to Simon.
Hi, everybody. I am Simon with Cleveland United Against War. And most of what I'm going to be talking about will be NATO's relationship to the military-industrial complex and how the war profiteers work in with NATO behind the scenes and what have you. I will now pass it to... Who have we not gotten to? Is that all of our speakers for today?
I don't know if anyone from Grand Rapids wanted to speak. I don't think, I think Emerson originally was going to, but if anyone from the other anti-war committees wanted to, they're more than welcome to. I have added that onto our slideshow, which I will be presenting as soon as we're done our introductions.
Hi, yes, sorry about that. This is Michelle with Palestine Solidarity Grand Rapids. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was included in the panel, but I will be speaking to you all, so I guess I am. Yes, I'm filling in for Emerson while they are currently out of the country, and I'll be speaking about NATO as it relates to Palestine. Thank you.
We had shelves that Scott's and we had lots.
All right. Without further ado, I think I'm going to start doing a screen share. Bear with me, I've only done this a couple of times. It decides to load. All right, does this work for everybody? You can just put a little emoji if you'd like. I'm seeing many thumbs up. I'm going to take that as a yes. All right. I'm just going to give a little bit of, okay. I'm just going to give a little bit of a rundown of the specifics to this regional aspect of NATO. What is NATO? For those who do or do not know, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was signed at the beginning of April of 1949, at the very beginning, or the dawn, you could say, of the Cold War in response to the end of World War II, with the reconstruction of Western powers. It was signed in Washington, D.C., and it was a slow additional expansionist treaty organization that's still remains to be an intergovernmental military alliance with several articles in the treaty that deploy and activate the member nation states to cooperate with one another in case of one member or multiple members being involved in non-member conflicts. So you had West Germany, France, Britain, Italy, Norway, many Western European countries join this treaty organization. And in the fall or the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as well as the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, it was decided that NATO would remain in place, adding other European countries, especially in the East, like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and we will go in later in how expansionism works for NATO. But in the meantime, it is a very integral part of Western powers, how they operate in tandem with one another in their security programs and military operations, war, etc. In the early 90s, during the Balkanization period, the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the Dayton Accords were written and drafted and negotiated at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and then signed later in Paris. And as a result, to commemorate Dayton's involvement with that, there is a NATO summit every so couple of years where they make a NATO village where basically all commerce and community activity is suspended and basically taken over for this security event. Ooh. I'm just going to read the mission statement we want to accomplish locally. So as a campaign and coalition, we aim to educate the citizens of Dayton, as well as surrounding municipalities, about the exploitative and brutal nature of NATO, its non-treaty members and allies, and as well as domestic governments on the local, county, and state level, such as Ohio, and how they are integral in maintaining the power and legitimacy of this aggressive, imperialist, intergovernmental military alliance. And again, I guess at the introduction, I had explained earlier how and why this was set up to, I guess I'll expand on the necessity of the United States and the key role of the United States being the heart and mind of the project of NATO, NATO is basically their entire budget and their entire military forces at a minimum 65% American, contributions. Um, Currently, it's not just the North Atlantic that they operate in now, but they have expanded operations with other non-state members in the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific region, Latin America, Central Asia, you name it. There are other members who do contribute a decent amount to the expenditures and military forces, such as Poland, Britain, and France, but NATO is largely an American project and an American investment to keep American hegemony across the world, through soft power and through brutal military power. So again, we're looking at, I have two images. Um, hold on one second, make sure it's, there we go. So the gentleman in the corner were some of the military council founders. The man on the far left was member of the Wehrmacht during the Third Reich in World War II. The military industrial complex of the United States and allies sought to quietly launder their involvement in fascist takeover of Europe, to reassemble West Germany as a bulwark against East Germany during the Cold War, especially in their proximity to the Warsaw Pact members in the USSR. NATO, along with the CIA, started programs such as Operation Gladio, and that one of those little badges at the bottom is one of the paramilitary groups that Operation Gladio deployed to basically suppress and crush any kind of anti-imperialist movements, any sovereignty movements, or people who did not want to be caught up in the West. Again, as a force, NATO, we see it, as shown in the mainstream media today, it is shown as a defensive alliance. But as you can see, like in the very beginning, through subterfuge, sabotage, and fascist paramilitaries, they were quite brutal, and a lot of partisans, a lot of innocent people were killed as a result. With the dissolution of the USSR, they kind of shifted to Southeastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East. NATO powers and NATO forces were very active in the war on terror in the late 90s, even into the current day. And I don't know if we wanted to move to Daniel or to Oz. Yes, that was a great example with Greece. Yeah, the uprisings in Greece, and even today in Turkey, there's still leftovers of their version of Operation Gladio with the Grey Wolves and the ultra nationalists in the eastern part of Turkey, as well as the far right violence that we see. So that was Brad who said that. Mike Goodman brought that up. Good point, Mike. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Oz. He can share some of his expertise if he doesn't mind.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for all the information you shared. I will a little bit talk about the current developments happening in the Europe. Before then, I can a little bit explain the situation where I am at. I'm in a country where is part of European Union. It is not part of Europe, but 5 NATO military power, 5 countries currently exist, and 2 of them still occupies the territories of my island. And it is just few miles away from Palestine, Syria, Egypt, and all the places that imperialist terror is spreading for decades. And that is why, I mean, the NATO's presence in Europe is vital because NATO uses Europe as a deployment hub, a reach to the Middle East and North Africa, not only Cyprus and many locations. But right now, when we come to the current situation, we knew that NATO is a shell company. It was a shell company owned by the United States. And these days, it is shows some signs of crumbling. And when it shows these signs, there is a panic in the European governments, the minions, Western European countries. They are panicked, and right now over here they are talking about creating some kind of an alternative for NATO, another imperialist military alliance. And that has effects, of course, for the people in the region. Also, when I say region, Middle East and North Africa, and also people in Europe. I will share my screen with you. Please let me know if I will be successful. Could you see the screen? Wonderful. I see some thumbs up. All right. So these are. I will first of all share the current developments here, because when the European governments start talking about creating some alternatives or the giving life to the NATO, that's mean the military expenditures and defense expenditures raise. And that's mean that, of course, people's, goes to the people's pockets. That means more tax, that means less social services, and it effect on the people's daily life. A few datas I would like to share, just the general data. Since 2005, in 20 years, the defense expenditure of the EU countries are more than double, more than 100%. And it is in last 3 years, the defense investments also doubled. And this year, maybe you heard that in Europe, for the first time, they created a program called Rearm Europe. Later, they changed the name with the pressure from the Meloni, the Italian government, and the French government, because they found it so aggressive. And they thought that maybe with changing the name, it will look more cute. And they made later Readiness 2030. And this plan, it means that 800 billion defense expenditure budget from European Union to the European Union countries. They aim to boost as you know, NATO asks for the member countries to dedicate its 2% of their GDP to the military. And right now, the European Union's average, according to the data in 2023, is 1.3. So it is lower than the NATO's expectation. But with this program, Rearm Europe program, they aim to increase every country's military spending by 1.5% of their GDP. Of course, this means that the institutions like European Investment Bank, which is normally exist for providing funds for the European countries for their social services, cutting those monies and giving those allocated amount of monies to the military expenditures. And here in the next slide, again, this is, as I say, that means that the relaxed EU budget rules allows country to borrow more military spending, and of course less for healthcare, housing, and education. And in Europe, people are not happy about that. That's why all over Europe there are protests are happening, and I will talk about the Resist NATO campaign in Europe. Last year in United States, you guys started, and this year we are continuing in Europe. And because of these developments, the anti-NATO movement in Europe is rapidly increasing. A little bit also mentioning the Europe's importance for the NATO. As you know, the main military bases, main command bases of NATO are in Europe. These are the supreme headquarters of Allied Forces Europe, which exists in the Brussels. The Allied Joint Forces commands exist in the different countries like Netherlands and Italy. Again, NATO's Rapid Deployable Corps. This also exists in countries like Italy, Turkey. So the main, the machinery of the NATO is exists in Europe. And in addition to that, of course, the NATO members, most of the NATO members are in Europe, and their national bases are used by NATO, such as the famous ones are the Ramstein in the Germany or Incirlik in Turkey, in the southeastern Turkey. And on addition to that, few other mentions, because it is also related to the region. The NATO, right now 32 countries are member of NATO, but with the partnership programs of NATO, such as the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, Partnership for Peace, and Mediterranean Dialogue, with these, again, cute names, the NATO has around more than 40 members, actually, around the world. And of course, the NATO military bases or different tools exist in those countries as well. And in addition to that, the NATO's presence in the semi-colonial entities. Of course, the first ones comes to our mind are the unsinkable aircraft carriers, such as Philippines, like the US, as you know, with the different agreements, military agreements, uses the Philippines for its imperialist purposes. Even small country like Netherlands, which there will be in June, the NATO summit will be happening in the Netherlands, still has its bases in the Caribbean, in Curacao, St. Martin's. They are serving over there as a NATO country. And of course, Cyprus, a British colony until 1960, a country who gave a national liberation struggle, anti-colonial struggle, but still, since 1974, NATO-backed occupation, still the military bases, NATO bases, exist in Cyprus. This is just a map of the US fleets. As you know, because it's the Mediterranean, the Sixth Fleet, which is the second biggest fleet of the United States, which caused pains in our region a lot. This fleet is also controlled in the centers in the basically Europe. Italy, the headquarters of the Sixth Fleet is in Italy. And that's why it is the Europe's importance. And as you can see, the Sixth Fleet is one of the most important fleet that covers Europe, Middle East, most of the part of the Middle East and Africa. So the Europe is quite important for the US imperialism. And I'm going to just a small example that I want to give as a case study, the country that I live in and the developments in the last few years. I mentioned that Cyprus is occupied by Turkey since 1974. British bases are still in Cyprus since 1878. And these are currently used in the genocide against Palestinians and the attacks on the Yemeni people. But last 5 years, also France and the United States started to, use the bases in Cyprus. And currently, and the Greece also exists. And currently, half of the island is occupied. And again, as I mentioned, every year we are hearing another military base built on the island or giving use for the NATO bases, NATO's use. I don't want to take so much of the time. I will shortly talk about also what we are doing here. As I mentioned, we are continuing the struggle you started in the United States. In the June, there will be in the 24 and 25 June, there will be a NATO summit in Netherlands, the city of The Hague, where the international law, the center of the international law, let's say. And we are going to make our own Resist NATO counter summit over there in a protest action. There will be two protest action, actually, one before the right before the counter summit and one during the counter summit. And these are flyers that we are using. As you can see, one of our partners, Vito, has a nice flyer like "No peace in the city of justice." And we use this slogan a lot, and we like it because, as I mentioned, The Hague is city of justice, as it's referred to. And I would like to mention the points of unity of the Resist NATO campaign, because it is important. All around the world, we have a political trap in Europe as well. What is that trap? It is the liberal politics or pacifist politics. The political parties and organizations who try to don't support the resistance or national liberation struggles, as you know. And this is, the illness exists in Europe too. But with the Resist NATO campaign, we are clearly supporting, and it's the only campaign in Europe at the moment, anti-war, anti-NATO campaign that supports national liberation struggles and resistance. And we have 9 points of unity that summarizes basically everything that I mentioned and more. It summarizes the programs, partnership programs, and how they are use of NATO to spread the terror, as is it seen in the point number 5, where we say we oppose NATO's collaboration with non-member states through partnership programs such as Mediterranean Dialogue, Partnership for Peace, Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, and other frameworks that include governments such as Zionist government of Israel. And the other points also mentions the effects of the military spending, effects of the NATO, and the rising of the right-wing politics in Europe. And generally, as I mentioned, it concentrates on the national liberation struggles, supporting the national liberation struggles and the resistance. Yes, thank you very much for listening. And I'm passing it to Matthew.
All right, that was awesome, Oz. Thank you very much for your expertise, especially for those of us that are, at least speaking for myself, that are somewhat new to this line of organization and organizing work. Very informative. I appreciate it. I guess I'll go find a way to go back to my slide. Okay. Um, Before I know I'm only introducing the coalition slide, but to wrap up the history background part, at least of at least the domestic side of things, I want to talk a little bit about Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Um, so the whole point of why in the Dayton Accords, the United States, along with NATO members and NATO allies, chose Dayton was because they wanted some place that was kind of off the map. Um, Dayton's still not a very big city, and it certainly was not a big town back in the day. However, Wright-Patterson has always been significant in terms of if what's the word I'm looking for? Aircraft and aviation creation. The Wright brothers, the first to have a successful flight, not just in the United States, but the first flying aircraft in the world. They were born and raised in Dayton. Um, Dayton is very proud of its aviation history with the Wright brothers, but also with the United States Air Force. So while it being a sleepy town, and it certainly is a sleepy, small to medium-sized city now, Wright-Patterson is a household name and has a very quiet in what's the word I'm looking for? Like impact on everyone. They're probably the region's largest polluter in terms of vinyl chloride and other toxins into the Miami rivershed, as well as the Ohio rivershed where it pours out into. They're a huge part of our politics in terms of military contracts, high employment. Um, they're a huge contributor to gentrification in the area. The recently built highways, as well as the very large suburbs of Springboro and other areas around the town, have displaced a lot of longtime Dayton residents. Um, and as well as they have basically, through legal and not so legal means, basically have a grip on our city government or at least our county government as well. Everyone has to play ball with Right Pat. So, um, because of the Dayton Accords, this is why we're having a summit here in Dayton, which is, in the grand scheme of things, historically and contemporarily, in the middle of nowhere, not one of Ohio's biggest cities. It's not comparable to Cleveland or Columbus or Cincinnati at all. In fact, I believe it's even smaller than Toledo. But this is why it's here. Um, the Clinton administration wanted to choose an arbitrary place with a military presence that had the facilities to hold diplomatic negotiations. So they chose Dayton in the 90s. And the city is very proud of its involvement in the Dayton Accords. However, the Dayton NATO village we get every year, we're not so proud about. And that comes from all avenues and aisles. It displaces the unhoused population in downtown Dayton. It brings commerce to a screeching halt. It increases traffic accidents. Um, it's really just a big burden for military contractors, DC officials, international NATO reps, you name it. The most out of touch people on the planet to just play around downtown. So, without a further ado, I'm going to introduce the coalition of everyone here who came together and what we plan to do in terms of our involvement with this campaign. So the Dayton Anti-War Coalition of Friends, that's me and Liz, our comrade, and a bunch of other locals who are interested in being kind of the core or the grassroots parts of this protest. Um, Several of us are involved in Palestine solidarity work, as well as just general anti-war, anti-military industrial complex work in the Southwest Ohio region. Um, so I was the one who wanted to put this together. I've had a lot of great help from local comrades, out-of-state comrades, and wonderful international people and experts as well. And I guess we're the kind of the nuclei of the thing, We're first timers, but we plan to have a good demonstration to bring down to downtown. you want to hand it off to a member of ILPS with talking points, what we want to achieve. Not sure who we want to hand this off to, but if anyone from ILPS wants to chime in, they're more than welcome to.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, I can speak a little bit on behalf of ILPS before hearing from what's happening on the ground locally in the area. Yeah, thanks everyone for sharing so far. Thanks Oz for some of the background. It's really inspiring to hear how you and the people of Cyprus are really taking up this struggle against militarization and for the liberation of your homeland. Yeah, my name is Daniel. I'm based in Seattle. Happy to be joining here today, and was a former member of the Resist NATO steering committee from last year that ILPS helped to lead. And I'm going to share a little bit about the role of the US in NATO, and then why the people of the US should be against NATO if it wasn't already clear enough from folks' sharings beforehand. So yeah, I think folks have probably heard the framing US NATO combined as sort of a phrase. And we say that for a reason, right? It's to emphasize the pivotal and central role of the US in NATO's operations. NATO, really, we can understand it as an instrument of US-led war. As if $1 trillion military budget isn't enough, the US uses military alliances like NATO to string other countries along for its own ambitions. For NATO, US is seen as pretty much the leader de facto. It is the main decision maker for which NATO missions are taken up. And the US, through NATO, has access to NATO military bases around the world, in addition to its own military bases, the almost around 800 overseas military bases that the US operates. And so the US uses its superpower status to essentially wield the structure of NATO, the expectation and the requirement for this mutual defense as marching orders for its own wars of aggression. So it can sort of string along other countries as it's sticking its head in other people's business and violating the sovereignty of other countries. And then when responded to, can draw in all of its allies through NATO to launch aggressive military campaigns and attack the people of other nations. And so NATO really has been one of the ways that the US has maintained its its position as sort of a number one imperialist power in the world today. So some of the most recent and obvious kind of examples of the US's role in NATO has been with the recent war in Ukraine. Of course, despite Ukraine not being a member of NATO, it has been heavily supported by NATO as and sort of the surrounding countries as part of the US-led proxy war really there with China as the US with Russia as the US is building up in the area. But, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as mentioned before, is a bit of a misnomer. The campaigns and operations of NATO expand way beyond the North Atlantic or Europe, and really just reflects what the US geopolitical interests are at any given time. So if we go through the history of NATO, there's a number of different instances we can see it reaching out, expanding beyond sort of its initially stated scope. In 2004, it was really the first direct mobilization in NATO history. with against Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, which was a major source of U.S. oil imports at the time. And so through part of the NATO governing laws, this Article 5 drew NATO members into a U.S. invasion of Iraq and ultimately a 20-year occupation of Afghanistan. This was not in the mandate of NATO originally, of course, but right as it's developing and sort of even from its inception has always been really a tool of the U.S. to dominate wherever needed. 2009, right? Operation Ocean Shield, targeting piracy in the Gulf of Aden around Yemen. NATO's drawn in to arrest and kill ultimately plenty of fisher folk trying to make a living in the area. In 2011, NATO's drawn into the war on Libya, right? At first through support for uprisings to topple Gaddafi, this incursion into the sovereignty of a country, but then outright intervention through airstrikes on Libya, establishing a no-fly zone, leading to, really devastating conditions. In 2012, at the Chicago summit, is where NATO declares the strategy to pivot to Asia, which is really the U.S. playbook, right? The U.S. is kind of rolling out and building up to a war against China in this pivot to Asia, and it's reflected in the NATO 2030 vision that Oz was mentioning earlier. That sort of seeing China and rivalry there as one of the priorities of NATO at this time. Yeah. So I think throughout history, it's been clear really how NATO has been a tool of U.S. imperialism. And so, of course, we all have a stake in opposing U.S. imperialism, but maybe more specifically, why we should be against NATO as people living in the U.S. For the most part, although not everyone on this call is, right? But yeah, I think it's really important to highlight and promote the fact that there has been resistance to NATO since it was founded. It is not in the interests of the people, and we know that. ILPS itself has had a rich history of opposing NATO. The US country chapter actually was founded in 2012, basically, in among mass opposition to the Chicago summit that was mentioned earlier, the NATO summit that was held in Chicago. Really, in the founding of the U.S. country chapter, already born into it through resistance to NATO. And then, as folks mentioned a little bit, this past year in 2024, ILPS US helped to wage a months-long campaign in opposition to the NATO summit that was held in DC over the summer. Just maybe to get a show, is there anyone on this call that participated in the Resist NATO coalition or was part of that opposition last year? Maybe you can share in the chat if you were there. But it was a really inspiring campaign that was waged by dozens of different organizations across the country, and culminated in a mass mobilization and summit. For those that want to take a peek, there might be some photos being shared in the chat as well. Would definitely encourage folks to check those out. But yeah, it culminated not just in a mobilization, but also a people summit. I remember walking into a sweltering room in the middle of the DC summer, just filled to the brim with hundreds of people with a stake in the fight against NATO, determined to resist it together, and to bring more people into the struggle to build out a mass movement. Um, we heard incredible panels from different groups sharing about all the different reasons to hate and oppose NATO, right? We heard about the local impacts on the community in DC itself that was brought from that mobilization and the summit. We heard about, the closing off of the metro in DC, similarly to what Matthew was sharing earlier, displacement, right, that comes with these types of events and the heavy militarization of the police. We heard from a number of different groups, sort of coming from the traditional anti-war movement, really different sectors like veterans, environmental groups, church groups, were all participating in this major confrontation to resist NATO as one of the highest kind of forms of militarism in the world. And then we heard from people uplifting the struggle of their homelands against NATO as it violates the sovereignty of people around the world. So there was a strong representation of national liberation movements as part of this Resist NATO summit. People with a stake in opposing U.S. militarization, U.S. NATO militarization, right, of their homelands, and with a stake in liberating their people from the grips of U.S. imperialism. And then, of course, one of the big things that drew everyone together was just this the ridiculous, really, spending that NATO drives on militarization, right? We heard about the quota that countries need to meet the 2% sort of their GDP as part of NATO membership. But all of that money is money that could be spent on actually meeting people's needs, and instead is spent on new equipment, weapons, fancy technology to further enrich the world's ruling elite. And so it was really an incredible kind of peak moment, and I'm hopeful that folks are able to mount strong resistance both in Ohio and in the Netherlands this coming year to continue that fight. ILPS had been waging a campaign called Defend People's Struggle, and especially highlighting NATO's role in counterinsurgency. As we know, not only does NATO contribute to equipping the militaries of other nations with these counterinsurgency tactics to try to tear apart people's movements, but that militarization will always come back around and feed into the militarization of our communities here in the U.S. So yet another reason to be opposing it. And so, we took all of the content from this summit, from the months of campaigning, webinars just like this one, discussions with many different groups that we were bringing in, and channeled that anger, that knowledge, that experience into a fight in the streets, and mobilized hundreds against NATO in the seat of empire, in DC, in front of the White House, in sweltering heat, of course. We could not be stopped, and to show, the world that we will not tolerate NATO in our communities. And not only will we fight back everywhere that it goes, we will also build a mass movement to oppose U.S. militarism and imperialism in all its forms. And so as the U.S. is trying to consolidate its power, right? As we're seeing Trump and his administration desperately holding on to the US's position as the global leader and really lashing out on the people of the world. We're seeing more money for police, more attacks on migrants, continued support for the brutal genocide in Palestine that we'll hear a little bit more on later. It's attacks on the successful Yemeni resistance, right? We're seeing the US pressuring Europe, putting it really in the ringer to handle Russia and pulling out of Ukraine to focus its priorities on a massive military buildup in the Asia Pacific with increased war games, joint operations with other puppet militaries, pre-positioning of military equipment and war provocations. All of these are reasons sort of heading into this next moment, right? The tensions are really ramping up. U.S. militarization needs to be opposed now more than ever. And so we need to continue to resist NATO as a tool of U.S. imperialism and really encourage folks, to continue this fight, continue the struggle, and please plug into the ILPS Defend People's Struggle campaign as well, which is one of the ways we continue to carry this fight against militarization, because we know that people's struggle is really the solution to NATO. People's struggle is the solution to U.S. militarism, right? We need to build out these fights, build out the mass movement, and strengthen people's resistance around the world, including everywhere from Seattle to Ohio to Cyprus. So with that, I'm going to pass it back, and thank you all for having us on.
That was great. Thank you very much. Very informative from our great friends at ILPS. They do amazing work globally and domestically. It was very informative. I'm glad it touched basically every vein and every cornerstone of what's going on with American imperialism at this point in time. Especially at a time where we're looking at this administration looking to spend $1 trillion, $1 trillion for a military budget. So now more than ever, we have to activate. So I'm going to hand it off to Cleveland United Against War. What do they have to say? What is Cleveland's United Against War's part in all this? I'm going to hand it.
Oh, well, so with Cleveland, we have something to build on top of talking about how much of a brain drain it can be. So much of our engineering education, so much of that is just a funnel towards your Lockheed Martins, towards your General Dynamics and what have you. I mean, I know people personally that I went to school with that then went on to college here at Case Western Reserve University and became missile designers. And it is deeply tied into, I think, the entirety of the Midwest's production lines. It is tied entirely into how all of us interact, not only just with the United States military as a whole, but the military industrial complex altogether. Because to kind of piggyback on what other people have been saying, there is this benchmark for defense spending that happens amongst NATO countries. But within that 2% of GDP, you also have a requirement that 20% of that spending has to be on new military equipment. It can't be on past models. It has to be 20%, has to be brand new things. As well as anything you spend on has to have interoperability with other NATO equipment, see United States equipment. Now, what that ends up meaning is, while you're not actually forced to buy jets from the United States, your jet has to be able to talk with American jets. Your missiles have to be able to talk with American missile systems. And that ends up being a very large production cost that is added on at the front end for the smaller members of NATO. And this leads to just more and more countries saying, nope, we're just going to buy the American. And it is just so much easier to just buy from American companies. Not only in this way, it is NATO then uses this and pushes its foreign interests to escalate situations that allows them to get rid of their old equipment to be able to buy more equipment. So we're seeing this right now, especially in Ukraine, but then also with Israel and Palestine. I'll allow the later speakers to get more into that. But the usage of escalating foreign policy to allow to, now we get to sell guns to Ukraine. Before it was we got to sell guns to the Bosnians, to the Serbians, whoever we felt like selling guns to. We create these instabilities to build these not only markets for buying arms, but also for and actually I see your point, Mike, in the chat, and I want to speak to that in just one second. They build these escalations towards more and more conflict because it allows them to create these markets. And then it also works as a laboratory for them. Essentially, right now, we are getting to see older NATO equipment running up against what had been Soviet equipment. And we're getting to see, oh yeah, how well did this actually work? And now we're able to refine, spend more money on research and development, and then get to throw the new toys at the Russians. And on top of the benefit of all of that, it doesn't even have to be NATO members, children dying. We can send other countries' children off to die, and we get richer off it, and further our global interests. So we have that laboratory on military targets in Ukraine, and then we have a laboratory for civilian targets in Palestine. One of the main things that gets brought up is the usage of AI and things that have been a big change in this current genocide in Gaza. So sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. So we use all of these foreign policy things to make ourselves, we get to become richer off of this. We invade Iraq in 2003, and Halliburton ends up getting quite a bit richer from it. And, you wonder how that happens. But to quickly go to Mike Goodman, I know we're waiting on questions, but I saw this one, and it was one that was interesting to me, and something hopefully other panelists are going to be able to speak on. But one of the things was the idea of the Mediterranean Dialogue was basically a program to get Israel into NATO. But it kind of backfired in this way because all of the countries in the Mediterranean Dialogue had to be moving together towards joining NATO. One couldn't move so far ahead of other countries. So what ends up happening is Egypt lags behind in the process of joining NATO, which disallows Israel from moving further and further forward. They get around this, though, as officially we're not supposed to do joint NATO military exercises with Israel. So instead, the United States does it by itself. Or it will do it with, the United Arab Emirates and with Greece. And so we kind of bend the rules when it comes to Israel. But yeah, so there is that. But yeah, that's it. NATO not only is a tool for primarily U.S. Imperial missions, though it had been at the start also while the UK and France were major colonial powers. And while it still works, it is also a huge way for us to make a lot of money. There is so much money that is about to, change hands at this parliamentary assembly. So many, backroom deals that are about to happen about, the banality of the thing is it'll probably be two people talking about whether to use magnesium in a pipe that's in a jet engine. But each little person does their part that builds to this greater whole of U.S. imperialism, both military and economic imperialism. With that, I'm going to pass it back off. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Cleveland, or I should say, Simon. That was incredible. Very informative. I appreciate the nooks and crannies of what specific membership programs and partner programs and how the politics of that look like, outside of the North Atlantic, as well as what Daniel was saying as well in regards to what's going on in Palestine now. It's just crazy to make you think, about how they get certain, I guess you could say, client states to get along with one another to enact the United States' brutal and horrific programs it has across the world. But anywho, going on, I want to shift gears to Palestine solidarity in Grand Rapids. I don't know if it was Michelle that was going to speak for Grand Rapids or not, but I'm going to pass it off.
Thank you. Yes, it is me, Michelle, speaking here from West Michigan to you all. Thank you for having me. So here in Grand Rapids, Palestine Solidarity has been organizing for the past year and a half or so for the Palestinian liberation movement. And a lot of our focus has been on our local war profiteers such as Plasan and Woodward. And we continue to organize and bring awareness to having these war profiteers in our own backyard brought in by our own governor. But when it comes to NATO and Palestine, as Daniel had said, NATO is a tool of U.S. imperialism. So even though Israel is not a member of NATO, its position as the attack dog for the U.S. provides the Zionist project great benefits directly from the NATO member states. And because NATO prioritizes obligations to its own allies over obligations to international law, the global imperialist powers continue to provide arms to Israel and increase their military spending budgets in support of the U.S. and Israel. And this we know is in despite of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice ruling last July that came out against Israel, showing that Israel is in fact showing signs of committing genocide in Palestine, as we know, but NATO continues to ignore this ruling and the demand of an arms embargo against Israel, which would align with international law, the arms embargo would. And NATO continues to supply arms for the genocide and impose sanctions on those that support the Palestinian resistance, such as Yemen, as we've seen. And this, of course, as other folks have said today, is led by the U.S. Additionally, we're seeing increased mass surveillance. So what we witnessed, the Zionist project of Israel test in Palestine, which Simon briefly touched on, we're now seeing come into our own neighborhoods. We've witnessed the targeting of fellow organizers in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, from the arrest and threat of deportation with Mahmoud Khalil to an FBI raid that happened right here in Michigan 2 weeks ago, just across the state from us in Ann Arbor, of some students at the University of Michigan who organize for Palestine Solidarity. So we know that what we are seeing in Israel, what we are seeing funded by the US, supported by NATO, is coming here, has a direct impact on us. So we continue to resist. And we know that by resisting US imperialism and resisting Zionism, it's a natural piece to the movement to also resist NATO. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think that is a crucial component to our Resist NATO advocacy. We appreciate the great work Grand Rapids is doing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Um, let's see what's next. I'm going to throw it to Detroit Anti-War Committee. I imagine they have some great things to say in terms of not only their pro-Palestinian work, but also in general their resistance against American imperialism in the greater Detroit area. I'm not sure who wants to speak, but I'll let anyone sound off. Why not have uh, panel capabilities for our friends at Detroit Anti-War Committee at the moment? Is there any other uh, coalition group members that would like to chime in to say anything before I go on to the conclusive and Q&A part of the panel? All right, I'm going to have some help with our friends on who are wrapping on technical support. I'm not sure how we want to handle this, if we want to do a queue through the comment section or through emojis on our panels. I'm going to hand it off to who's going to be managing this. I don't know if Liz or Cody want to take ownership on this. If you need help, I'll be more than happy to chime in.
I think we have a few enough people here that we can just do raising hands if people have questions.
Sounds good.
Or if anyone just has any comments they'd like to make about any movements going on in their own areas, or comments on our own coalition here, anyone's welcome to speak.
Don't see any hands yet, but I'll give you. Oh, I got Palestine Solidarity here, so there you go.
Hi, this is a question from one of our group members. Do we have an estimate for how many folks we're expecting to attend the protest on May 24th?
So, from what I've gathered so far, I'm thinking just preliminary numbers. This is not going to be final. This is going to be bigger and shift around, but like the very minimum, I'm thinking like 15, 20 people so far, but that number can grow. We're still doing outreach in our local area, and people might be able to commit later on. In terms of people coming out of town and out of state, that also might be more, but off the top of my head, I'm thinking around 20, 25. It looks like we have a question from Celia. I missed exactly why Israel's not a part of NATO. Would anyone mind repeating that? Um, Simon, did you want to re-clarify that real quick since that was part of your portion or
Sure, yeah. I don't have too this portion I'm kind of the least prepared on for it, but my understanding of it is one of the ideas was to create the Mediterranean dialogue. And really the idea of that was to get Israel into NATO. But they had to kind of make it look like that's not what they were doing. So part of the things within the Mediterranean dialogue was every member of the Mediterranean dialogue had to be moving towards NATO membership at least a similar rate. One country couldn't be much closer to NATO membership than others. So Israel obviously is just continuously pushing the boundary of how close they can get to NATO membership. But then Egypt begins lagging behind. And so from that, they were able to block Israel from officially joining NATO as a member state. I hope that mostly answers the question. I'm not sure why they haven't tried it in other ways, but that's my understanding of it.
I also want to add that part of the reason too is that it's not officially a part of Europe, and Europe is the main audience for Prime membership. And while they have tried to add them, if they outright added them as a member state, it would kind of give the game away of what NATO is about as well, from what I understand as too. But yeah.
And Mike, Cyprus itself is not, but Turkey is. And actually, why don't we pass this off to Oz? I see he has joined us again.
Hello. Actually, Cyprus is not member and cannot be a member technically, but they don't need it anyway. Turkey and Greece were the first members of the NATO. Because they didn't want the Soviets to reach the warm waters. And it was in 1955, Cyprus was a British colony. But in 1955, the future leader of the Cyprus, which his name was Makarios, he was the person who participated in the Bandung Conference. Bandung Conference was the conference that anti-colonial leaders of the world participated. And in 1960, Cyprus was founder of the non-aligned movement. So Cyprus was always close to, from its establishment in anti-NATO bloc. And also rejected in 1960s NATO offered Cyprus to be a member, but Cyprus rejected it because it was part of the group of Cemal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Tito of Yugoslavia, Nehru of India. In that anti-imperialist bloc, it was it, and that's why in 1974 NATO organized the occupation in Cyprus, which in 1974 Turkey occupied half of the Cyprus, and the problem basically for NATO solved, punishing the Cypriots for being anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and currently having the 5 NATO militaries on the island. So basically NATO doesn't need Cyprus because NATO is already in Cyprus. That is the reason.
Excellent. All right. Okay, I'm gonna go to you, Sangeeta.
Hi. I was curious, what are some ways that we could conduct outreach in our city? And how can we identify like organizations to kind of cold approach? I guess, do you guys have any tips? Thanks.
Yeah, so we'll be making more like paper material to hand out. If you have any access to any like, local universities, if you're by Ohio State or by anywhere like in the north, like the old north part of Columbus, anywhere you feel like is a good place to, there's a confluence of young people or like-minded comrades who want to get involved to come in at the end of May and help us protest and march. That would be awesome. There'll be more information on that. Um, I'm thinking about adding more social media stuff to our Instagram page. If you have an Instagram, feel free to share it. That'll help our outreach in Central Ohio as well. Um, yeah, I would just say I know it's not the best answer, but at this point in stage, I would just say spread the word, and this is going to be happening on the that Saturday at the end of May. What the exact date is again? Let me pull it up. The 24th. I'm going to go to Tavish, if that's all right. Did you have any? Is there any addition on that, on Sangeeta?
No, thank you. That is helpful, and some materials would be great that we could distribute. Thank you.
Yep, we'll work on that. All right, Tavish.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry to rehash the same question as before, but could you all please give me some more clarification on how exactly Egypt was blocking Israel's admittance to NATO? Do you guys have any more do you have any more details on that? If not, that's okay. I understand that wasn't fully prepared.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. So my understanding of it, and I don't know if Oz also has dug into the how much of like the Mediterranean dialogue, but there are these certain steps that build you towards NATO membership, and all of these countries in the NATO dialogue need to be moving in at a similar pace. So if one country isn't meeting those steps, the others can't continue forward. Oz, I don't know if you have more information than that.
Simon, what you say, I mean, like, what you say is correct, totally. But I mean, like, if we go one step before, why they created the Mediterranean dialogue? Basically, as you know, for a country to be a member of the NATO, all NATO countries has to accept that. And in the case of Israel, that can be problematic. Of course, NATO serves for Israel and everything, but countries also have their internal dynamics. For example, some countries in Europe and part of NATO, there will be always, for sure, one or two country could reject that, not because of they don't support Israel, but because of the probably internal political dynamics in those countries. And Mediterranean dialogue was created basically to bypass that. And and I also like Simon explained it the other part very well, the technical part.
Thank you so much for that.
I was going to add a little bit maybe to a previous question, if that's okay. The question on outreach and how best to kind of conduct it in the area. I'm not super familiar with the Dayton scene, I did grow up in Minnesota a little bit, so I have some Midwest experience, but just in terms of the general sense and the experience of ILPS US, something that we found very helpful is in building out a wide kind of range of a large coalition to oppose NATO. We tried to identify and work with sort of the community to identify all the different reasons people would have to oppose NATO. Of course, many folks maybe on this call or involved in the organizing may be sort of anti-imperialist or have um, yeah, different backgrounds and reasons for being in the fight. But there's also just lots of different groups that we wouldn't normally think of engaging that could be, able to turn out to a protest or a webinar or something like to be able to raise consciousness and really expose NATO in the area. And so, I think something that helped for the Resist NATO coalition in the past was we created a couple points of unity that were relatively broad that we could get a lot of people behind. And then in drawing people together in the space, we're able to share the different angles and perspectives on reasons to oppose NATO. So would definitely encourage folks beyond just kind of the anti-war groups or pro-Palestine groups or some of those folks in the area, thinking about, what churches could be engaged, what schools, environmental groups, what communities from like migrant communities that may be impacted by NATO. What are all of those different opportunities to draw people in to create really a broad, united front of people power to oppose this very narrow target of NATO? It is one of the very few benefits of NATO impacting so many different communities, is that it creates the avenue to bring even more people into the struggle.
Thank you very much for that sage piece of advice. We definitely have been struggling a little bit in terms of outreach. Dayton is a very different beast, given a lot of Dayton citizens depending on the right pet Air Force Base um, for jobs and stuff like that. But we have some similar strategies that you've suggested and some other ones that you've also provided that we're definitely going to implement. So thank you very much, Daniel. We will put that to good work. Okie dokie. Any other hands raised? All right. If we're all done asking questions, I will move on. All right, again, our mission statement, just to wrap up, we want to educate and activate our communities and the broader community of Dayton to resist and protest NATO and their military industrial complex fair that they're bringing to downtown. So here's the two things we plan to do in terms of what's going on that Saturday. We plan to have a little summit as well as a march in around the area of downtown Dayton. And we plan to do it at a park east of the event. I'm working on permits to march down into the street where we will chant and we will hoorah all the way down to the plot on Jefferson Avenue, where we will continue our protests. There'll be other groups there protesting it as well. So that what's in motion, basically, our educational reach out, what we're doing right now at this very moment, as well as further social media outreach, is what's going to be happening after this presentation, as well as I'm going to be fighting with City Hall to get these permits done. Wrapping up any loose ends, is there anything us and our panelists that have yet to be touched on that we like to have addressed? Well, folks, I'm glad you came. It was a wonderful time. I'm glad to share in community internationally with people who want to stand up against injustice, against American imperialism, against brutality. Solidarity forever. I want to thank everybody. If anyone just wants to shout out into the mic or into the chat, they're more than welcome to. Love and peace.